Magnus Carlsen recently said that the only person he wants to play for the World Championship is Alireza Firouzja. And when he said that, everybody stood up and took notice. That means that Carlsen must think that Alireza is the most compelling and strongest opponent that he has to face. Now, I hope Magnus isn't right. I hope that if Firouzja doesn't qualify, I hope Magnus still plays. But I definitely think, and I think most of the chess playing world thinks, that Firouzja is the most compelling and most interesting opponent for Magnus. And one of the reasons may be this game that Magnus and Firouzja played against each other. My name is John Montgomery. Welcome to Chess Dog. And this game was played against Firouzja, who had the white pieces, and Magnus Carlsen, who had the black pieces, at the Gold Money Asian preliminaries. This was a rapid game. Both sides had 15 minutes with a 10-second increment, which means that 10 seconds was added to the clock after each move. Let's begin. Again, Firouzja has white. He plays e4. Magnus responds with e5. Firouzja plays knight to c3, or the Vienna opening. Knight f6, bishop c4, bishop c5, d3, d6, and now f4. Using that f pawn as a lever to open up the center, that's the advantage of the move. The disadvantage of the move is that it makes it very hard for white to castle kingside. Knight c6, knight f3, a6 to tuck the bishop at c5 away at a7, bishop to b3. Now, this is actually the 10th most commonly played move in this position, and I'm not exactly sure what the point of the move is. The bishop stays on the same diagonal. The most commonly played move is actually f5, gaining space and clamping down on the king side, but that move is a little premature when black hasn't castled yet. So he plays bishop to b3, again, the highest scoring move, but the 10th most commonly played move. h6 is the move played by Magnus, keeps a piece out of g5. Queen to e2. This sets up the move bishop to e3 so that Firouzja could castle on either side of the board. Bishop g4 pinning, fe5. This is the game's novelty. The only other game that reached this position, bishop to e3, was played. This was in a low-level game. A couple of 1,600 rated players. A 1,600 and a 2,000, actually. In 2001, he had black. fe5, de5. Now you have the half-open f file for white, the half-open d file for black. Bishop to e3, getting the last piece off of the back rank, and now Firouzja can castle kingside or queenside. The knight jumps into d4, queen to f2 to get out of the threat of the knight and also to put some pressure on these pieces. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes knight, leaving a weak square at f4. The knight goes to h5 to jump right in and take advantage of that weakness at f4. Firouzja castles long. He doesn't want to castle on the king side with all these openings. And the knight jumps into f4. And if we assess the position, it's pretty clear that Magnus, with the black pieces, has some very well-placed minor pieces. The disadvantage, though, is that white has these extra central pawns. This pawn at f3 helps support e4, and of course he has an extra central pawn on the d file. And also, Magnus hasn't castled yet. Firouzja has, so he's got a bit of a lead in development. That's his compensation for black's well-placed pieces. So king goes to b1, a standard move when you castle long. Knight takes bishop, eliminating the two-bishop advantage. Bishop c5, knight c5, queen c5, threatening the pawn at e5. So the queen goes to d6, defending the pawn and offering an exchange of queens. Firouzja takes Carlsen up on that offer. Queen takes d6, c takes d6. So now we have an equal but complex and unbalanced endgame with lots of play left. And it's become pretty much a consensus in the chess world that Carlsen is the greatest endgame player in chess history. Even better than Capablanca, even better than Karpov. Carlsen is the best there is. So here is Firouzja playing in what is essentially an equal but complicated endgame against Magnus. How does he do? Well, it's really interesting to see, and this may be one of the reasons why Carlsen thinks he's the most worthy opponent. Let's watch what happens. First, he plays d4. That's his central break. He can't play f4 anymore because the knight is blockading the f-pawn. So he plays d4. Long castling for Magnus is now rook to d2, possibly preparing a doubling up on a soon-to-be-open d file. The knight goes to e6, sort of taunting that d-pawn forward, saying, go ahead and play d4, and I'll play the knight to f4, locking the center. Firouzja plays knight to e2 to defend the d4 pawn. And now rook h to f8. It would be a mistake to just take this pawn, because then that would just create a weakness on d6. So Magnus plays the rook at h8 to f8 to help play f5 to pry open that file. But now Firouzja does go ahead and play d5. And what this does, after the knight moves, of course, because it's threatened, is it allows him to play c4, c5. This is basically like a King's Indian structure, but it's in the endgame. And he wants to play c4, c5 and gain counterplay on the queen side, and Carlsen wants to play f5 and get counterplay on the king side. So he plays knight to g5, moving the knight away, attacking the f3 pawn, rook to d3 to defend it, knight h3, which threatens knight to f2, which would fork the two rooks, and the rook at h1 goes to c1, backing up the c pawn and preparing its advance to c5. Carlsen plays his pawn break, Firouzja prepares c5, fe4, fe4, rook to f2. A double attack on the knight at e2 and the pawn at h2. And here Firouzja does make an error. There are a number of errors in this endgame that, I know this, of course, because of computer analysis. But it's very complex. And, of course, it's a bit faster time control. It's not a classical time control. It's not blitz, but it's not classical. But there are a number of back and forth moments in this endgame. And here, Firouzja makes an error. He plays knight to c3. Better options, one to do would be to just take the knight for the knight, or even just plow ahead with c5 here. And if Carlsen takes on e2, he could take the knight at h3. But knight to c3 allows Carlsen to take the pawn at h2, and now Carlsen has these two pawns, these g and h pawns, connected, unopposed, and they can move forward on the king side, and they look a little bit faster than Firouzja's counterplay on the queen side. He goes ahead with c5. The knight goes to f4, hitting the rook moves. King moves away from line of sight of this rook at c1. c6, going forward. Rook to c8, and now knight to a4, aiming to cause some trouble by landing on this b6 square. And now Carlsen returns the favor by making a mistake. He plays rook to e2, attacking the e4 pawn, and that looks to be a reasonable move, but it turns out a little bit better move here was king to a7 to keep that knight out of b6 and keep it from causing trouble. So after rook to e2, Firouzja plays the knight to b6, rook c7, knight to d7 check, king to a7, Firouzja plays rook to c4 to defend the e4 pawn, and now h5. Magnus begins to move those kingside pawns forward, aiming to the queening square. Firouzja plays rook to g1, and this move seems to hand the advantage back to Magnus. A better move, and something he ends up doing later, would be to play a4 immediately. The idea is to play the pawn at b2 to b4 and b5, threatening to fork at b6, and this rush of queenside pawns from white is very strong. In fact, he would need to respond with a5 to prevent b4, but after knight f8 threatening to come into e6, it looks like Firouzja can cause enough complications to survive the endgame. He plays rook to g1, aiming at the pawn at g7. Pawn moves to g6, defended by the knight at f4. Now a4. Now the idea that we just looked at, Firouzja now plays it. His idea is to play b4, b5, and swarm on the queen side. And here, Carlsen needs to play a5, but he does not. Instead, he plays h4, advancing his kingside pawns, and now b4. And just like that, after the advantage going back and forth, now Firouzja has the advantage, and the threat of b5, b6 is incredibly strong. Carlsen plays b6 first. Now, that stops the mobility of Firouzja's pawns and fixes them in place, but Firouzja, after b5, a5, this c6 pawn is just a beast, protected twice by a pawn at b5 and d5. I mean, this is a really nasty long-term advantage. But Carlsen realized he had no other choice. He couldn't let those pawns roll forward. And now Firouzja plays this brilliant tactical idea. He plays knight takes e5, giving up a piece, which really cannot be taken, because of the knight is taken, then d6. And there's a rule of thumb that 2 pawns abreast side by side on the 6th rank are often worth as much as a rook, and that is definitely the case here, maybe even more so, because they're helped by this strong pawn structure. This would be totally lost. So Carlsen cannot take the knight. Instead, he plays h3. And here Firouzja makes a mistake, a little back and forth. He plays rook to h1, which seems like a reasonable move. The better move is knight to f3, using that knight to help control h2 and sidestepping a tactical shot that Carlsen executes after rook to h1. Carlsen here plays, boom, knight takes d5. And now, if e d5, rook takes e5, and Carlsen is back in the game. So instead, Firouzja plays knight takes g6, and now knight to e3. And in this position, Firouzja is winning, and he does not give up the advantage. But there is a computer solution to this position for Carlsen. Computers find this brilliant move, rook to f7, giving away the knight for active rooks, and that secures the draw. After pawn takes knight, rook comes into f2, and let's look at a couple of lines. Of knight f4, rook to b2 check, king to c1, now rook to a2, which actually threatens rook to a1 mate. If he goes back to b1, you just repeat moves, obviously. He goes to d1, h2, protecting that pawn, and if knight to d3, hitting the rook at f2, then check, and king to e1 and check. And if instead he goes to c1, then just rook takes knight. Now, looking at this position, and again, I had to access the computer to figure this out. If c7 is played, threatening to queen, black's trick is this. Rook to g3. And if white queens, this is actually mate. So that is why advancing the pawn doesn't work here. But Carlsen plays knight to e3. Firouzja plays rook to c3, getting away from the knight. Knight to g4. Knight to f4, hitting the rook on e2, as well as the pawn on h3. After rook e4, knight to d5, hitting the rook at c7. Knight to f2, then knight takes rook, rook takes h3. And the threat of rook to h8, rook to h8, rook to a8 mate is so strong that essentially when white runs away from black's checks, he will be completely winning. And in this position, because of that threat, Carlsen resigned. So Firouzja was able to beat Magnus in an endgame, obviously a messy endgame, but it was very complicated. And I think it's games like this that caused Magnus to say, this is a worthy opponent. This is the one I should be facing for the World Championship. I hope it happens. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Bye.